You've been put on this new project. There's a bunch of code. You're not familiar with it. And you've been asked that, hey, your first task is going to be to add some functionality, make some enhancement to this code base. Good luck. So what do you do? And where can some of the things that you've learned about agile development actually help you in this task? Well, the first thing you got to do is get the code running. And we've seen that with software as a service, there are various ways to do that. But a great strategy, because you know how to use version control and you're comfortable with Git, is to check out a scratch branch that will never be checked back in. So this is a branch whose sole job is to do what you have to do to get the code running. You might have to make little changes here and there. You might have to change some config files in order to get it to run in your environment. You might have to somehow get a partial copy of the production database so that there is some data for your development copy to operate on. So all of these tasks may require minor changes to the code base. You want to avoid any possibility of accidentally screwing up the real code base. So create a scratch branch, and that's kind of your playground. And the first thing you can start to do is learn the user stories. In an ideal world, it's got a whole bunch of great integration tests, and there's documentation saying what the user stories are. Maybe there's like scanned copies of those 3x5 index cards. In reality, that is often not the case. So one thing you can do is talk to the customer and get them to show you what they're doing. Watch them use the app. Ask them, what are the most important workflows that are the ones related to the thing that you're going to have to modify? Watch them go through those workflows. Ask them questions as you go. So you're basically creating your own documentation as you go. Right? So that's the level of how does the app behave? Like, let's call that the sort of BDD level of the app. But there's another level where you need to know, okay, how does that behavior actually map onto the way the app is architected and the way the code is implemented? So you can also try to discover the domain model. Remember that when we've talked about the domain model of an app as the way that you talk about the things the app does, movies, moviegoers, reviews, those things have to be represented somehow in the app. In the case of a framework like Rails, they are represented as models that are backed by a database table. There has to be a way to express the relationships among those things. Which things depend on which other things? Does one thing have many of another thing? Which classes rely on collaborators to do some of their work? So understanding the database schema, if it is a database-backed app, is a great way to do this. And as you're exploring the database, you can create a domain model or entity relationship diagram that basically shows graphically how some of those tables are related and what the main models are. There's a number of different gems that will do this for you, and I'll show you an example of one of these in a moment. But what you're looking for is, what are the most important classes, right? And how can you tell if a class is important? Well, if it's connected to a lot of other classes, it's probably pretty important, right? That means that that class has something to do with the behavior of some of these other classes. And we can also talk about what are the main responsibilities of the class and its collaborators. Remember that responsibilities are things like, what information does this class own? What behaviors or functionalities is this class responsible for versus which behaviors or which responsibilities are in other classes that this class has to collaborate with. And again, if you think about a model view controller type app, like what Rails or other frameworks would support, the relationships among the database tables will tell you a lot about the relationships of the underlying classes in the app. This is an example of a diagram that comes out of the Rails ERD gem. It basically runs automatically. It looks at both your database schema and the headers of some of your Rails classes. And you can see that, there's relationships of classes that have sort of one-to-many relationships directly. There's these dotted arrows for indirect relationships, like through associations. I had mentioned recently that I'm a big fan of Fred Brooks's book, The Mythical Man Month, about lessons from doing a big software project. One of his quotes from that book says, "Show me your flowchart and conceal your tables, and I shall be mystified. But show me your tables, and I won't usually need your flowchart. It'll be obvious." Now, probably most of us are not using flowcharts. If you've never heard of a flowchart, it was actually a graphical way of depicting the imperative control flow of a program back in the days when programs were much harder to write. But if we replace the word flowchart with the word code or with the word application logic, we get the same idea. If you show me your application logic, but I don't see your tables, it's hard to figure out what's going on. But if you show me your tables and the relationships among them, I might not even need to see your code because the relationships among those data structures will tell me a lot of what I need to know. What else can you do? There's usually a lot of documentation in and around the code base if you know where to look for it. For example, we mentioned that tests are a form of documentation because they document separately from the source code of the app what the source code is supposed to do. So if there's a test suite, run the test suite. If there are integration tests, even if they're not written in a nice, super high-level pseudo language like Cucumber, do the integration tests have enough for you to follow so you can see what the app is trying to do. What are the important workflows? You can also look at statistics like how good is the test base. You can look at the code to test ratio. Remember that we said a simple static measurement is how many lines of tests compared to the number of lines of code. A number greater than 1 is not unusual. And you can actually sort of get a sense of the size of the code base and the ratio of code to tests just by running rake stats. If there's a way to collect coverage information while you're running the test suite, you're not just looking for like what's the percent coverage, but look at where the coverage is. Is there good coverage around the places that you might have to change? You might also be lucky enough to find informal design documentations. For example, at one time, maybe somebody did draw some pictures or make some wireframes about what the app is supposed to look like. Maybe they go along with the user stories. So can you find those? The project has a wiki or a shared Google Drive or an archived mailing list. These are all places where you can find documentation to fill in the gaps of what is not available as part of the code base itself. A lot of projects also use some software to do project management and keep track of what is to be done. For example, even in CHIPS 10.5, you'll be using GitHub project boards as a way of tracking individual tasks or stories and assigning them to developers. Pivotal Tracker and Basecamp are two other project management software. Trello is a pretty popular lightweight project management software. So if there's a project management board, see what kinds of tasks are on the board historically, and often there will be design docs attached to those tasks. So you might have to do a little excavation. And whatever you do, as you learn new stuff, add to the design documentation, right? Add to the base so that the people coming after you will have an easier job of it than what you had. If there's documentation that's embedded, so JavaDoc and RDoc are tools that will look for specially formatted comments in the source code and generate API documentation pages from them. Some projects essentially mandate that the comments in the code be parsable by documentation generators. Others don't, but try running it. The worst that can happen is you don't get anywhere. But if there's embedded documentation that separately documents the actual code in the code base, then you're a step ahead. So those are a few places that you can look for as you do your initial exploration of the code base. And next, we'll talk about what happens when you inevitably discover that, unfortunately, there's not enough test coverage around the areas that you have to modify.